Thank you very much, Greg. So, yep, I was just telling Greg and Michael that this is the room I defended my thesis in. So if you see me go in and crawl up in a fetal position and start breathing heavily, just send someone over and have them whisper, "Don't worry, after 8 years, they let you graduate. It's over." And hopefully I'll be better in a few minutes. So I want to talk to you about research ethics and research ethics in human subjects experiments. And this is joint work with a bunch of folks who do a lot of usable security research. So one of my co-authors is Janice Tsai, who's also at Microsoft Research. She was a graduate of Laurie Krainer's usable security group out of CMU. Serge Egelman at UC Berkeley, also a graduate of Laurie Krainer's group out at CMU. And Christian Bravo-Lilo, who is a current student of Laurie Krainer's at CMU. So I should start off by saying I am not and never have been a student at CMU. Research, human subjects research more and more is being done online. And it's being done online mostly on Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with Amazon's Mechanical Turk, it's a system that helps people who want to have some free time and want to do some work. Actually, they generally look a little bit more like this: office workers who aren't getting any calls at the moment, or folks in India who want to make a few extra bucks. It's primarily demographically skewed American and India, mostly English speaking, and people who have menial tasks that require some amount of human intelligence that they can't be automated. And it's a marketplace that connects these people with work, often below minimum wage, which creates all sorts of fun issues. But lots of researchers are attracted to this because you can put up a research survey or a study as a piece of work to be done, and you can get 1,000 research participants in an hour, whereas it used to take you weeks to be able to run studies on 30 participants. So this is great, and I want to sort of give you a feeling of how this looks from a researcher, from a participant's perspective when you're doing one of these studies. And so I'm going to spend 5 minutes boring you going through and doing one of these studies, just to give you a feel of what it's like. So this is Mechanical Turk. I'm logged in. I'm going to search for work, and hopefully there's something out there fun, like a game I could do. So let me search on games. So let me check out this study for evaluating online games. Looks like it pays $1. View a hit in this group. Okay, 18 years or older. Yep. In the United States, using Windows. Looks like I can do that. Okay. To be paid, follow these steps. Go to this link. Okay. Then I'll receive a confirmation code. Okay, so this is an online games evaluation survey. I have a consent form. Now, since looks like it's by Julie Downs at CMU, since I'm getting paid per task, any time I spend on this consent form is really just lowering my annual wage or hourly wage. So 18 years, yep, I've read it, sure. Great. There we go. And let's see what I need to do. Click on a link below, play a game for 2 to 3 minutes, and I'll answer some questions. That sounds fun. Okay. Mars Buggy. Okay, looks like it takes some time to load. There we are. Okay, given this demo a few times, so I should be pretty good. Well, not that good. And I won't bore you playing this 2 to 3 minutes. Okay, so was I able to play the game? Yep. One sentence description. I drove a buggy, but did so very poorly. Okay. Have I ever played this game before? Let me be honest. Yes. Was it fun? Mildly. No glitches. Any content or language that might be inappropriate for children under 12 years old. Here's a great example of a great use of mechanical Turk. In this study, you can find out whether there's anything that you can send adults off to find out whether there's anything inappropriate for kids. Great use of mechanical Turk. Any other aspect of the game that could be improved? No. OK. And so let me just go through one or two more of these just so you can get a sense. Oh, did I miss something?
Yeah. Scroll down.
Bad, Stuart. Oh. Oh, there we go. This was much easier with a mouse. OK. Let me skip the second game. I'll just say I wasn't able to play it and cheat. Why was I not able to play the game? Because I'm lazy. I'll play the third one. OK. And here's the third game. And this one also seems to take some time to load. Looks like it needs to install Silverlight. OK, and it's installing. So there were some chuckles. How many people know what this study is about? Raise your hands. OK. Do you want to explain what this study is about?
It's about whether or not you would send your password.
Send my password where?
In the box that we just saw, which perhaps wasn't even initiated by this type itself. It might have been a JavaScript box.
OK, so this is a deception study. Sorry for the, this was not about, we don't really care whether there's any content here that's inappropriate for kids. What we care about is that when we bring up this fake dialog, which is entirely rendered in JavaScript, whether people think it's part of their operating system and can be fooled into entering their password, because if they are, any website could do this. Or are they able to detect somehow that this is not actually a legitimate window, which they could if they, for example, were to try to drag it out of their browser, or to do this, which lets me scroll through my windows, which you can't see here, sorry. And so this is a deception study. I'll actually be my co-author will be presenting it in a couple of days at CCS. And so this illustrates a lot of the issues that we have to go through when we're trying to design ethical studies. Well, is it OK to do deception? How do we get approval to do this? And what do we tell participants after we've just done this to them? In usual design, we would have some kind of disclosure that would tell them what we'd done and then get more information. And we do. So let's go back to that. Go back here. If we were to actually keep going, we would say, well, actually, I wasn't able to play the game. In fact, the game never loads. So we ensure that no one can. I'll just enter garbage there for a moment. And we're going to get starting questions of, we'll start getting questions about, have you had any requests to enter your password? And if I were to keep going there, we'd get questions about, we'd end up reaching a disclosure where we tell people what we've been doing. So this is one of the reviews we got back when we submitted this for publication. Very surprised this work passed your IRB, and IRB is an institutional review board or ethics board. I am deeply troubled. This crosses the line. Now, those of you who have submitted papers to conferences and gotten back reviews know the stages of grief that you usually go through when you get a review like that. First, there's angle, then there's denial and bargaining. And at this point, you don't think you're ever going to reach acceptance, the last stage of grief, unless you bribe the program chair. So this type of review, I show this kind of in part from the researcher's perspective, because I can't show you, I might have given at one point a similar review because I might have thought something got through someone else's ethics board that shouldn't have. This person has a legitimate concern about an ethics study, and they don't believe that the IRB has done its job in preventing what might have been what they consider unethical research. So there's a real conundrum here faced by a program chair and the research community as a whole. How do we keep unethical research Was this unethical research? Should it have been done? Where is this line? And we had to respond to this review. And the anonymous review process, it really is the wrong place for this, in part because I'm from Microsoft. I was spoofing a Microsoft interface. So we were basically spoofing ourselves. And when you look at it that way, it's a very different, in some ways, ethically, right? The fake interface was also from Microsoft. And so in order to fully understand what was ethically going on here, you have to know that the authors were from Microsoft, which you can't in an anonymous review process. So the anonymous review process really isn't the right place for it. On the other hand, as a person who's reviewed papers where I've wondered about the ethics, I'm deeply sympathetic to the reviewer's position here because they are seeing something that they feel crossed the line. And they have reason to believe that maybe IRBs aren't doing their jobs. Because let's look at what IRBs really look like. So these ethics boards were created about 30 years ago after a lot of unethical research or questionable research in psychology with things like the Milgram experiment here at Harvard. There was the Tuskegee medical experiments where they were actually giving people syphilis. And so these medical review boards, these institutional review boards, are dominated not by computer scientists, but it's more like a medical researcher, a doctor, an economist, a lawyer walk into a room. It's not a place where you expect to have people who are experts in online systems, in computer science. You're talking sociologists, psychologists, and biologists and medical doctors. And so could harmful research get past these folks? Well, in many ways, they're often not qualified to understand what's going on in computer security research. And when you look at there's a particularly interesting interaction here when you have computer security researchers. Because when you think about what an IRB is, well, it's a protection mechanism. It's designed to prevent scientists from doing bad things to people. And what's a computer science researcher? It's someone who learns and makes a career out of getting around protection mechanisms. So people have a real right to be skeptical about whether research is ethical, even if it gets past IRBs. What generally happens is, we don't actually usually have to go into the room. We have to explain why what we're doing is okay, why it's not going to hurt people. They want to make sure we're not hurting people. Well, we're computer scientists. We say it uses encryption. It's generally good enough. If you really want to social engineer the issue, you get the name of a nice Jewish Harvard professor, and you figure these doctors will like it if you throw his name before the encryption. So I like to view IRBs something like a black box, right? So I'll take a systems perspective again, right? IRB is a black box. You have this nice thick line in it. You get put lots of information into your proposal. Yeah, there are some rules that IRBs have. They have the common rule, a lot of which came out of all of those unethical research studies that were going 30 years ago. There was a Belmont report where they made these recommendations, and so and there's now a common government rule for what all of this government-sponsored research has to go through. But most of it's guidance on what gets reviewed, and then it's sort of left, well, the benefits have to outweigh the harms, and you go figure it out. So there's laws, right? If the research is going to break a law, that the IRB would probably raise a concern. There's some precedent, but mostly IRBs don't talk to each other, right? They get something, they review it, and then they give back their response, and then it's in the hands of the researchers, and it doesn't often get shared. And there's, obviously, you break other social norms, people are going to notice, and so there's sort of opinion, but a lot of that really is opinion. So the biggest input to an IRB, in my opinion, is board members and what they bring to the table, which brings in a lot of a sort of sense of randomness. So if you ask researchers how they view this IRB process, where they submit their proposals of the research they'd like to do, they most likely have this model of how IRBs work. And it's somewhat justified because all these board members bring their different opinions, and you send the same proposal into two different IRBs, and you'll get two totally different sets of concerns and feedback. So as far as concerns about unethical research getting past IRBs, it is kind of random, so maybe that would discourage some people from submitting things that probably shouldn't get submitted. But and maybe if you submit something that probably shouldn't be done, you've got only a 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 chance of getting through an IRB if they've got some decent chance of having some good experts there. But of course, if there's a really tempting study that lots of people would want to do, it's not just one IRB that has to get it right, right? In the US, there are thousands of research institutions, all of which have their own IRBs. And so if there's something that's just on one edge of the line, and some IRBs might let it in or some might not, and it's going to be, there are lots of researchers tempted to do it, it'll probably get done. So I think there's a legitimate reason for people to be skeptical that IRBs are able to perform this purpose today of keeping unethical research from happening. And there's, yeah, so.
Do you have to go through an IRB being at Microsoft?
I do not. There's a process where we talk to lawyers, which sounds awful when you say you have to talk to a lawyer. I've actually found it, I found like half an hour sitting in the office of a lawyer who spends all of her time focused on computer science far more valuable. I got more legitimate concerns out of the lawyer than I'd gotten out of any IRBs I'd interacted with. And when I responded with a legitimate, here's how a safeguard that can protect people, I felt it was also much better understanding there. That said, almost all of the research I do is joint with universities. So I'm regularly sending things to the CMU IRB, to the Berkeley IRB, to the IRBs of people I collaborate with. So almost all of my research ends up going through an IRB. And that study that I showed you that we were doing went through the CMU IRB. So there's been a lot of attention on this lately. The 2011, those of you who know the computer science funding community probably know a guy named Doug Mond who funds a lot of computer science research. He put together this group that created this Menlo report, which was trying to update the ethical guidelines for the age of information science and computer science. On the other hand, they don't really have any new data. They just have new problems. There was a panel. There's been changing rules and a number of conferences about whether you have to explain what IRB process you went through when you want to publish a human subject study. And there's been a panel, a number of panels at recent conferences on how do we deal with some of these ethics problems. But what we don't have is any new data to add to the discussion. We see lots of discussions of new problems, but no new data that would help us try to answer these ethics problems in any kind of quantitative way. And so what we decided to do was that we really wanted to bring some quantitative data to help address questions of ethics, that we wanted to take the scientific skills that we use normally and that we want to focus them back on ourselves to see whether we're being ethical and whether other research that's being done in security and outside of security that might be ethically controversial, what do people think of it? Do they think it's worthwhile? So we think that by doing this, one, we can, if this data is public and it's accessible to all IRBs, then these ethics boards can be more reliable in the way that and more consistent in the way that they enforce ethical guidelines. If they're more consistent, this benefits researchers because researchers, when they submit a proposal, will have data to back up whether if it's something that people have already done or if it's something that people have said is ethical in the past, they'll have data to back this up. So they should be able to get more consistent approvals when they're doing things that should be done. And the public should be more willing to be participants if they know that there's processes in place to make sure that these decisions are being made in a better informed way. So I want to play a quick game of bluff the audience. Is this a real study or not? And what you see here is what we call an abstract. It's an abstract representation of a study that we can give to people and then ask them for their ethical feedback on. And some of them that we present to people are real studies, and some of them are controls. Here is one of them, and I'll give you a minute to read it. And once you've read it, maybe raise your hand and put up 2 fingers if you think it's real and 1 finger if you think it's fake. we've got at least one fake. We've got some reals. Give people a little more time to read it. One finger's fake, two fingers real. OK. So most people think this is real. We've got a few fakes. For the people who think it's real, does anyone recognize it? Do you want to say where this research was done?
Here, maybe? I don't remember. It's familiar. I don't remember.
This was Indiana University, Marcus Jacobson's laboratory while he was there. This was called the social fishing experiment. And it was quite controversial. And after it, Marcus started trying to publish on the research ethics in the research ethics space, which was difficult for him because those people who didn't think the study was ethical weren't really ready to listen to him on topics of ethics. Something that concerns me very much since I want to be able to do groundbreaking studies, but I also hope to be taken seriously in this area. Yes?
Did the IRB raise any concern whatsoever about this before?
Yes, they did. They decided they would have a process where students could opt out afterwards of having their data used. And where there would be a discussion board where people could discuss what they thought, which resulted in many people using this discussion board to express just how much they thought the study shouldn't have been run. Yeah.
I guess I'm just getting lost as to, like, why not? I mean, you sort of said the IRB is meant to protect people from harm.
Right.
And so I'm unclear how, both from your statement of that and, this example, what harm are people concerned about?
Harm is not well defined. So, right, so people might, I think one sense of harm here would be that people would feel that they got tricked and they feel uncomfortable having been tricked, and that it gives them some sense of aggravation, some removal of their self-confidence. No one likes feeling played, right, to feel like you've been tricked by someone else. I think there's an instant
Question in terms of scientific research that that specific issue
Mm-hmm.
isn't specific to certainly computer science.
It's this is not specific. No, there's.
It has to have been resolved one way or another, at least as far as IRBs, or if it hasn't, then I don't understand what.
So the guidelines to IRBs are they're basically told measure the benefits, measure the costs, and so it's very subjective, right? So how do you measure the aggravation of knowing that you were tricked by someone? How do you measure the institutional cost, basically, that people may be less trusting of their institution now? So Indiana University may have lost some trust from some of its students in that they allowed their CS department to trick, or their informatics department to trick their students. Costs here, it's very hard to measure, and are we describing this in an accurate way? It's hard to know. Yes, Stuart.
The harm is, which is a completely legitimate view, that the harm is that somebody should feel bad because they were tricked. How does the IRB saying, well, what you need to do to mitigate that harm is to allow people to withdraw their data? How is that responsive?
It's part.
It seems like the response to the harm would be, well, in that case, let's say you don't tell them at the end of the experiment what was really going on. Then they won't feel bad about it.
So they could do that. I mean, part of the concern there is that the way these experiments are usually run is first you get some kind of consent. In the study I showed you, there was consent to being that we ran. There was consent to being monitored. There was consent to being part of an experiment and being observed. And then afterwards, there's a disclosure. And the consent form and then the disclosure of deception are the standard recommended practices. So by getting the consent afterwards, they were trying to make up for the fact that they couldn't get consent before. So part of that is they're trying to meet the ethical best practices, so to speak. Whether
That's not really withdrawing the data. That's retracting your consent to the study, which is, maybe it's a subtle difference.
Or you're right. It's opting out where you weren't given the option to opt in.
The feeling bad about being played. The problem with that is that if you think that that's a harm, then all deceptive studies go out the door. And IRBs historically, well before computer researchers were doing stuff,
Yep.
were approving deceptive studies because the studies, by their very nature, have to be deceptive, or you can't do the research.
Sure, but there was usually at least an opt-in consent, and there's sort of some expectation. Well, there's some expectation that when you do a psychology study, you probably recognize that there's a good chance that you may not be told what it's actually about. Let me quickly handle one more, and then I do want to make sure I get through to the end.
I have to say that the relevant principle probably is that the respect for persons.
Right.
So the fact that people participated in the study not knowing about it, so they should have an opportunity to say, no, I do not want to be part of it.
No, I wasn't seriously proposing that you don't tell them this.
So I think the retroactive consent and the feeling bad are actually separate issues.
I think one of the other concerns there might have been, since they were impersonating the friends, they were also exploiting this relationship, which not many other experiments have done. So a number of concerns there. So now I hope that's a good another good introduction to the possible ethical concerns, and there's possible ethical benefits there. Right? There's possible benefits to that study. Right? It gives you a more quantitative understanding of how some of these attacks, how effective they might be. So it's time to play researcher, and let's actually use these abstracts to see what people think about these studies. Are they objectionable? Should they be allowed to proceed, or should they not be allowed to proceed? And so we surveyed 247 participants. This was a somewhat convenient sample on Mechanical Turk. We would have liked a more general sample. On the other hand, for studies that are going to be run on Mechanical Turk, well, this is your general population of potential participant/victim, depending on your perspective. So for some of these scenarios, this is a great sample. For others, it's not. We asked them about 7 uses of compromised password data, because there's a lot of interesting computer security research being done right now on compromised password data, which I'll get to a bit later. We also asked about 4 more general research scenarios. And this is the question that we attach to all of those abstracts. So do you believe this experiment should be allowed to proceed, or does the risk of harm outweigh the potential benefit? We gave them 4 options: definitely allowed, definitely not allowed, in between with probablys. And for the second one, this experiment should probably be allowed to proceed, we added, but with caution. And this was because in our pilot studies, we'd sort of get this feedback where people weren't quite sure where they wanted to be. They thought the study was probably ethical, but it's really important that the researchers do this, that, and the other thing to protect the participants. And that's sort of a given here. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't getting people saying, no, this shouldn't be allowed because I have these other orthogonal concerns that the researchers won't do it right. So we added that, but with caution. So before I get to the results, let me just briefly say what the limitations of this kind of study are. It really is just getting a survey where you get people's opinions. And when you just survey people, well, first of all, they didn't actually participate in these studies. So we have to write these abstracts. That one I showed you was quite long to read, right? We have to, and obviously we left out a lot of details. We have to choose which details to leave out for brevity and which ones not to. And of course, people won't have actually experienced the study, and so their behavior might be different than it would have been if they had experienced the study. There's a question of, well, did we leave out the right details? Were we fair when we presented this research? If Marcus at Indiana had written up that abstract, he might have written it differently. We're probably going to go ask Marcus formerly at Indiana to write up his abstract of that study and compare to see whether people would have responded to that differently. And we'll probably one of our next steps is to go ask him to review whether we wrote that in a fair manner. People's reported opinions may differ from what they actually truly believe. And of course, as I said, we've got a biased sample here if you're talking about anything other than a study on Mechanical Turk participants. One thing we're planning to do about that is to rerun this study again using members of a jury pool. I served jury duty back in February. It's an absolutely wonderful opportunity for the government to do recruiting for you. They semi-randomly sample from the population and then put 300 people in a room together. It's just a wonderful, and it just makes a researcher drool. So The first scenario I'm going to talk about is the spam botnet takeover. This was, we wrote an abstract about this study. I'm sure a number of you are familiar with it. Some folks at UC San Diego took over a node of a botnet. They found a compromised node. They talked to the person who owned that machine. So it was someone owned a machine that was compromised by these attackers. That machine was being used to spam and to use a website and to host a website to which people could buy things from the spammer. They installed their own monitoring infrastructure so they could watch the spam go out and watch the purchases come in. They were monitoring both the spammers and this criminal infrastructure, and they were monitoring without consent anyone who got these emails and thought, I want to buy this stuff, maybe not knowing that spam was illegal, or maybe not caring. And so we asked people about the ethics of letting that spam infrastructure still run, which was one of their biggest concerns. And 13% thought this study should proceed, 29% said probably proceed, 29% said probably not, and a whopping 30% said probably should not proceed, definitely should not proceed. Now again, if these researchers had written this abstract themselves, or if they had reviewed our abstract, we might have used a different abstract. The results might have come out differently. So let me just say this is very early work, and we plan to refine this a bit more. Yeah?
I'm quite interested in actually probably proceed and probably not proceed. So when the questions were formulated, to what extent potential harm was spelled out by the people who formulated the questions for the participants?
So
because dependent on that, the result, the outcome would be influenced by that.
Right. So it's very. The question was the same every time: should the experiment be allowed to proceed or not? The abstract above it changed. And so I've shown you one of those abstracts. At the end of after I've given the talk, I've got all of the abstracts in my backup slides. If you want to see any of them, I'd be happy to show them. But it's far more detailed than an audience wants to sit through, at least any sane audience. So that social phishing experiment I showed you, this is the result for it. 15% proceed, 36%. So people were more positively inclined to the social phishing experiment, the way we wrote it up, than to the spam botnet takeover. This is the spoofing for password study that I showed you at the beginning. And here you can see a much greater portion of people thought this was acceptable. Of course, the abstract was written by one of the people who designed that study. So again, there's a potential bias here. We'd really like to find someone who has no interest in seeing that study do well on an ethics survey to come out and write one of those abstracts for us. And then the last one is worth explaining. This is a study that matches exactly the study that I showed you at the beginning of this talk, where we walk through and people play games and eventually we bring up a fake dialogue. But in this case, the fake dialogue is whether to install Silverlight or not. We're not asking for their passwords. And in half the situation, Silverlight by Microsoft, the publisher of Silverlight is Microsoft.com. And in half of the situation, Silverlight's from Microsoft with two I's, MIICR0 S0FT. And hopefully, people who see Microsoft with the two I's and the zeros shouldn't install Silverlight. And hopefully many more of the people, at least many fewer people should install Silverlight if it's Microsoft with the zeros than if it's the real properly spelled Microsoft. We're not saying that everyone should install Silverlight. Some people may just not want to install Silverlight in order to play a game. But we'd at least hope that you'd do it a lot less if it's Microsoft with two zeros. And so that in that study, no one's risking their password. But we are still spoofing. It's still a deception study. We're spoofing the operating system. No one's actually going to be installing software. So there's really a very low risk of harm. And so that one gets an 88% approval rating. And it's kind of easier to think about these things just if you combine the probably proceed and proceed together. This is what we look at as just the proceed versus not proceed. This allows us to do some statistical tests like Fisher's exact test. It's kind of a nice, simple way to look at the data. And again, there's no threshold here. There's no there's no point at which we'd say, oh yeah, if it's over 50%, party on. If it's under 50%, stop. But what we think this is really useful for is that you can see the relative differences. You can see, okay, when we weren't actually capturing passwords, people were more positively inclined to the study. Now, you might say, sure, but that study you ran with warnings that 88% of people approved of, if people had actually had to go through that study and been deceived, they would have been a lot less generous. And we wanted to find out if that was true. So just as a matter of by not so happy, or by not so coincidence, by happy not so coincidence, we were running this warning study at the same time as we were running this ethics study. So we could actually collect data from people right after we'd given them their disclosure of how we'd deceived them. And this is an abstract description of that warning study. And this, I said this too early. So this is what the participants who had actually participated in the study would see at the end of the study. So we write our disclosures. We want participants to like having participated in the study. We don't want them to write bad things on the Turk forums. So we have many strong incentives to write good disclosures. But we do tell participants what we did. So we tell them the true purpose. We tell them why deception was necessary. We tell them what was deceptive very precisely. And we explain that there was actually no potential for harm here. You couldn't have actually installed any software. And we care about safety. And then we let them know, yeah, we got ethics board approval for this. So those are all the important messages we want to deliver with our disclosure. And then after, we provide that same question of should this experiment, should it have been allowed to proceed, or should it have not been allowed to proceed? And so we can compare what people thought when they heard about the scenario in abstract to what they thought when they'd actually participated in it. And in fact, people we'd actually deceived and tricked said much more positive things about the study going forward. There's a number of hypotheses for this. One is, right, it's the enemy they know versus the enemy that's described abstractly. One is, well, you asked, right? You're the researchers. There's what's called the Hawthorne effect. People say things that they want to, people want to please the researchers, so they'll say nice things to them. So yeah, is there a question?
Yeah, did you consider running that text without the IRB thing at the end to see if people feel differently about the study if they know an ethics board has approved it versus if they haven't? We considered
a number of variants. That was not one of the variants we tested. But because we expected people, and by the way, this difference is strongly significant. There's a Fisher's exact test. We have 800 plus people in this group, so it's a very robust result. But what we did expect people would say of, well, you were the ones asking whether this was ethical. You're the ones running the study. Of course people said nice things to you. You were the ones asking. And not entirely. So we did have 3 different variants in those 850 people. They broke down into 3 groups of at least 250 people each. The first is we said, well, scientists at Berkeley are the ones who'd like to solicit this feedback on whether the study is ethical. This was not actually deceptive. Serge Augment is from Berkeley, and he's one of the scientists who wants to know. The second, this was a study run by CMU with Microsoft, but as far as the participants saw, it was a CMU study. So we said CMU's institutional review board in the second treatment is the one that would like to know. And then in the last one, we said we would like to know, so we could compare how people felt if it was the researchers asking. And then in these cases where it wasn't us asking, we said your answer to the following question will be shared with either those researchers at Berkeley or with the CMU Institutional Review Board. And ideally, we could have taken them to a third-party site where they could honestly believe, we could honestly tell them, you're giving this information to other people. That would be the sort of the gold standard, but we didn't do that. We were just able to say we're sharing it with 3 different, there's 3 different recipients here. But there was very little difference here. There was a slight increase with these third-party researchers. There was a very tiny difference where 2% actually said, people were slightly more concerned when they could express their concerns to the Berkeley researchers, but it was not in any way statistically significant when you just look at these 3 groups. They were all, however, if you compared any one of them individually versus the abstract scenario, you still would have had a very strongly significant difference. So it's possible again, that if we start taking people to a third-party site where they really are talking to someone other than the researchers, that they'd express more concerns. But it does look pretty robust that the way we wrote that abstract scenario, people were more concerned about it than if they'd actually participated in the study. So actually, let me just stop there because I'm about to transition for a few minutes. If there are any other, yeah. We tried. So this was done for all of the abstracts. So we. I'm sorry. So this is the only. So this is the only data. This is the only study for which we have a match between the abstract and the actual study. Because most of the other studies we wrote abstracts for happened 2 or 3 years ago, or something that may not have happened. So this is the only one where we have a perfect pairing.
At least that's what I would expect.
I would have expected that too until I saw this data. Now I don't know what to think. But it was 88%, right? There were 12% of people who thought that this study shouldn't happen, and that went down to 2%. So when you look at it that way, it's a pretty big decline. So, yeah. No population generalizes to any random population. You always have to look at the differences and see whether there's any reason to believe they'd be different. So they didn't, yeah, I mean, we didn't say straight out front it was an ethics study, but the people who took the abstract study were people who were willing to just take a survey, and the people who took the game study who were people who were willing to participate in that Turk task, yeah. So let me go through a little bit of background on password scenarios for just a minute. In 2009, Rockyou, a company that produced Facebook games, had stolen from it 30 million plain text passwords. And this has been a treasure trove for research. There's been lots of research on this password data set. And there's a question of, is it ethical for researchers to be using stolen data? The rules actually say as long as data is public, party on. But you could think of lots of scenarios where that's probably a very bad rule. And so there's a question of, well, what would people think about that? In July of 2012, Yahoo actually had 400,000 plain text passwords stolen. So this sort of provided an opportunity. We thought maybe we'd go and survey some of these victims to see what they thought. And so we had this idea, is it okay for researchers to use these publicly posted lists of usernames or email addresses and passwords for research? Because passwords obviously were not intended for research. And well, we didn't want to ask 400,000 people, but we thought we could just subsample this population, see how they feel about whether researchers should be using it or not. But before I go into that study, let me go back to the survey study, because before we ran that study, we figured we'd ask how people felt about that too. So we had 7 scenarios that we asked, 7 abstracts about possible uses of passwords. The first was, since it was a Yahoo breach recently, we asked about Yahoo. Is it okay for Yahoo to use that breach data to figure out which accounts were compromised and force people to change their passwords? And almost everyone said that it's fine for Yahoo to do that. The data was stolen from them. We asked whether it's okay for a third party, for instance, you could imagine that Microsoft or Google would take a look at that list, see if any of those people were using their Gmail or Hotmail accounts when they were at Yahoo, ask their email address, and whether they had a similar account with us or with Google, and if they had the same account and the same password, force them to reset their passwords, which is pretty much a standard, I would assume a best practice. People had more concerns about that. We did ask about research analysis. People actually didn't seem to have too much of a problem with the research analysis. One of the things that compromised password lists might be used for is to create a better password chooser, to let people know if they've chosen a password that's on one of those lists. If they have, tell them, hey, this is a popular password. There are 20 people who are using this at Rockyou. If they haven't, then it's probably a pretty good password. So would that be ethical? People generally thought that that did pretty well. I'm doing that, by the way, or I'm working on something like that. So again, there might have been a bias in how we wrote it. we added 2 fake things in there that have not happened, but we wanted some ground truth on what people would say when something was really outrageously bad. So this is it okay for people to log into Yahoo with that password to see whether it still works and figure out how many people have changed their password? There's some possible research benefit there. You can find out how many people change their password quickly enough. On the other hand, boy, that's illegal. And then, what about trying to see whether these people were using their passwords at other sites by trying to log into them? Also illegal, really bad. And it's good to see. Most people do respond to that and say it shouldn't happen. But there's always people who have the other opinion. So you start to see how there's always some people who will approve of just about anything and who won't approve of anything. So this is where it gets really interesting. This was our survey of the victims. This was going out and sending unsolicited email to people who were victims of that Yahoo breach and giving them these uses and saying, which ones are you okay with? And there was a big statistically significant difference between the research analysis that we were concerned about and that we thought people might want to have not happen with their compromised passwords, and what people thought about whether we should go forward with this survey of victims to see whether we should stop people from doing the research analysis. So big statistically significant difference, and this leaves us with a question for the audience, right? Should we go out and survey those breach victims? And I'm going to actually leave this to the end since I'm running a little late and want to get this wrapped up by noon for those people who have other commitments, or by 1 for those people who have other commitments. But love to get opinions later. I mean, the positive thing of doing it is we don't know whether we can trust that abstract data unless we have ground truth. On the other hand, if we ask, we're ignoring data that suggests we'd be causing more harm than good. So there's a definite catch-22 here. And we put this study on hold while we try to get feedback from people who might know more about ethics than we do or might have less biased opinions, and we think about moving forward. But I'll come back to that in just a couple of minutes. So I want to start wrapping up. There's one remaining sort of question or set of issues that I've alluded to but haven't formally presented. So let me just say that, right, as we've started moving more and more of our studies online, and it's not just computer scientists doing it, it's economists, behavioral economists, sociologists, psychologists, lots of researchers are using Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And the existing best practices for studies, which are if you're running a study, you need to get people's consent, and if you're deceiving them, you need to tell them afterwards. They don't necessarily make as much sense online as they used to, because every second I spend reading that consent is lowering my wage, and so people don't read consents. And we've removed all personal interaction from this process. So when I was running a study with 30 people over a week, I would give someone a consent form, let them read it, ask them if they had any questions. If they did, they could ask me. And then we'd run the deception experiment, and then afterwards I'd give them the disclosure. If they'd have any questions, they could ask me. If they were crying afterwards, I would notice. I might even be empathetic, depends on the type of researcher I am. And if I'm a really ethical researcher, I might even report to come back to my IRB that there was a potential for harm here. This person seemed really upset. But instead, I can today I can set a study off running and go play a game of golf. And all the people do is interact with these electronic systems. So it's great for the researcher. It definitely changes some equations as to how ethics works. So certainly technology has brought us new problems, but it also brings us the potential for new solutions. So, and I'm going to argue that these should be standard practice, that when we run deception experiments, we need to have a feedback loop. So this is what things look like now, where the IRB is a black box. Nothing actually goes back into it. The way this should work is that we have data from all of those previous studies that showed what was working and what wasn't in terms of trying to make them more ethical. And then when you run the study, the data automatically gets fed back into the IRB. And so they know exactly how it's going at any given point. And anytime there's a future study being run, they have all the data on, well, what bothered people when you were doing similar the last time? Now, this would be good within one institution, but what you really want is you want this data fed out to all of the other IRBs. So you want some place where you can go see how people responded when they were, any published study that used this process was run, so that you can find studies similar to yours and see what people's ethical concerns were, how ethical they thought the study was. So this would also potentially allow people to shut down studies as participants, which is very scary to researchers, but I actually think it's in everyone's best interest. First of all, researchers will work even harder to make sure that when we write a disclosure, that we do a really good job of it. Participants, though, I think will be even more supportive of studies if they know they have the right to shut them down, because then they feel like they're citizens in this process. They have a vote. And you're much less likely to feel victimized if you know that you're part of the process that allows this to keep going. If you get to say, well, yeah, I do feel a little harm, but I've been given a sort of a fair disclosure explaining why this is important, and I now understand why it's for the greater good that this allows to happen. So we think participants will be more supportive of studies if they actually have the power to shut them down. And this is actually what we've been finding from our studies, in that when we give people disclosures of how we deceive them, we expect people to be really upset at deception. And in fact, it's just amazing the supportive responses that we get. We get some amazing, people say this is a great study, well played. The vast majority, including from our original study, which I haven't showed you, that I showed you at the very beginning of the presentation, where we were trying to see whether people would enter their passwords. At the very end of that, we had just started doing this ethics research. We asked 200 participants to report to us any harm that they could, and just very few people said there was harm, and people wrote amazingly nice, positive things. Someone even volunteered their email address of, if you have any other questions, please contact me. So wrapping up, we're building this infrastructure. We think there should be a third party that you send people to after a deception study, where that third party can collect this data, store the data, have an unbiased way that it can get back to your IRB, that it can get where people can give feedback on how they felt and who they want to have this information. So maybe they want to report that there's a problem, but they don't want the researchers to know. Or they want to let the researchers know that there was a problem, but they don't want to rat them out to the IRB. This would give them a chance to say, who do I want to share my data with, and for what purpose? And are they willing to share it for future studies, so that when future studies are being run, they can decide, they can use this information to decide whether it's ethical or not. And so part of what we're doing is to build the infrastructure for those feedback loops. And these are feedback loops we're already using, just not only for that warning study, but also for the study at the very beginning, and that we're going to be continuing to use in the future. So with my last 2 minutes, should we survey breach victims? I think if we were to do this study, the way we would do it is, and so here's the big idea, which we have to make carbon neutral now, apparently. We start the study very slowly, and we can start running a sequential hypothesis test. The moment we know we're over a threshold where people thought we shouldn't have done it, we can stop it. If it turns out it looks like our abstract data was not accurate, then we can keep going. And that way that's a way you can actually fully minimize the harm, because you're fully minimizing the number of participants that you need in order to test this question. So parting thoughts, right? We should not just permit participants to weigh in on ethics, which is currently the way things are done. If you have any problems with this study, please contact the IRB. Here's the email address. No one ever does. We should actively encourage participants to be first-class citizens who provide their feedback on every one of these studies, loop that feedback back into the stakeholders. And we should turn IRBs, rather than into committees that just sort of sit and use their opinions, into consumers of data. And we should be providing them with more data so that they can have a more clear standard that they can use to make ethics decisions. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Great questions.
Right on time.
Salil. So yeah, it's not rude to leave. It's 2, but I'm happy to take questions for as long as you guys want to, for anyone who wants to sit longer. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering to what extent the role of an IRB can and cannot be reduced to how the subjects of the study would feel about the study. Which, if one takes this to an extreme, deemed, and takes, that this data really is going to dictate at the end whether the study's approved or not. That's more or less what it's saying. And people may disapprove not because they were overly deceived, but because at the end they find out what it is that you're actually trying to learn from the study, and that's not something that IRBs are supposed to. What you're learning, the scientific question that you're asking, they don't like where that's heading, and that's not something that's supposed to be.
I think that's fair to some extent. Let me take a slight random diversion. When people ask me why do I feel that the rule that exempts all research on public data is wrong. So I was at a panel where I argued against that rule, that we shouldn't exempt all public use of data. And the example I give is, let's assume that either the NAACP or does anyone know the largest gay rights organization in the country? Let's assume the largest gay rights organization in the country was hacked into, and that they provided for anyone who was a member and wanted to a health insurance plan. And all of the health insurance, there was now a big breach of a million health records of people who were likely gay. And let's say Oral Roberts University researchers decide that they want to establish a link between homosexuality and anything they can find that will get P of 0.05, where they can claim a link between that and something bad in being gay. Is this allowed within the rules right now? Depending on your reading of the rules, this is public data. It was broken into. Someone posted all of the information up on a website. Anyone can get to this data. Once the data is public, party on. Would the people whose data was being used disproportionately not want this study to be done or think it was unethical? Yeah. So in some ways, I actually do think we should care about what participants, how participants feel, not just about the harm, but about the benefit they're contributing to. On the other hand, you could imagine situations where you do have a question that's very split in America across political lines, 50-50, and you need to be able to research it. And if you give away, if you find a way to discriminate who's going to participate based on those who believe in your research question, you won't get an answer. So, in those situations, you probably want to allow the research. That's a really tough one. But for research that's not inherently, I think, political, I think for most research, I think it really does matter whether the participants do feel that the effort has been put in there to explain to them why there's a scientific benefit here. And that it's part of the job to the researcher to do that, because if you don't, it ends up, eventually things get into the court of public opinion. It just is a different number of stages. I'm proposing that you go to the court of public opinion first, whereas if you don't, well, what happens? Well, the press picks up a story. Then the press says, oh, Harvard's running this study, and a lot of people object to it. And then senators say, you're doing what with our, and eventually the court of public opinion catches up with you. Much better to just go to the court of public opinion first. And unless it's something where there's really something that scientifically is desperately valuable, but that people have some fundamental objection to for political reasons, I think most of the time you want to just get public opinion on your side first. Yeah.
To that point, I think there's also something about giving the opportunity for free-form responses along with whatever questions you're asking, because I think if you're looking at this data, if you're an IRB looking at this data, and you have a bunch of data from people saying, oh no, this is, answering a question that says this was harmful, this was bad, whatever, and their comments are all of the nature of, these guys just have a pro-gay agenda or something like that, then, I would hope an IRB member would be able to recognize, okay, this is actually about the content of the study and not about the ethics of the
Absolutely. You always want to get, I didn't show any of it just because of time constraints, but we always ask, please explain after any of these questions. So for the study we started with the password spoofing study, we had about less than 10 people concerned out of 199, and most people would say things like no harm, I thought it was fine and good trick. But we do have the text of everyone who thought that they had been harmed or who expressed some concern. Now here we can say one person thought they should change their password. Now if they have to go change their password because they didn't trust us, that's some potential harm. So we have a record of that, and we can explain to future studies what that was. We have, here's a person who thought there was harm but said thank you, so they clearly didn't seem too upset. We had people who just misunderstood things or didn't read very carefully, like I should be able to refuse to play a game. Well, if they had read carefully, it would say you don't have to, you can skip any game you want, but they didn't read. And which is partially our fault, right? We could have maybe done a better job of making sure it was clear you could skip any game. And people said, what if someone had actually put their information in there? Well, we told them what happened there. So we have all that data, and it's something we do mine, and it's very useful. But I tend to skip it from presentations for time.
What happens if someone puts your game study up, but doesn't tell them at the end and just takes all the passwords and hacks into people's email accounts?
They could do that. There's nothing we've done. They probably wouldn't put our game study up. They'd put something else up. Right. Right. Yeah. In order to watch this porn, you need Microsoft Silverlight, and.
I'd be curious if you said Microsoft was doing this study versus CMU and lawyers at Microsoft approved this versus CMU.
There's loads of things we might want to test. Yeah. And it's a wonderful place to start researching, because I don't know of anyone getting any data on any of this, whether people are more positively inclined to universities and trust universities more or not. Yeah, all the way in the back.
Compensation is a really tricky area of ethics.
Yeah.
The people that you asked if these studies were okay were people that you were paying on the mechanical Turk, right? And
right.
for them, the small amount they might be receiving could be a relatively significant source of income, right? So have you looked at asking people not on mechanical Turk what they think of this, or?
Right, which is. Yeah, we have a jury pool study that we wanna run for that. Although, right, mechanical Turk, the people who are in the U.S. generally are like secretaries who, right, or people who, right, they get phone calls, and when they're not getting phone calls, they might as well do something useful. So it's usually supplemental income. The people for whom it would be a lot of income might be people in India, and we've mainly been focusing on U.S. only for participants. Right. Amazon does check IP addresses, and we check IP addresses too, and there are geolocation databases. Now, people could be proxying. There are all sorts of ways to cheat on Amazon, and we also do a number of things to try to detect cheaters, which is a whole other. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of hypotheses that. This is a very rich area, and again, I'm kind of surprised that we don't know of anyone else working in it. So, yeah.
Just like, the comment I made earlier, I still feel a little bit baffled about the positive and negative consent. The degree of that you will get must have some correlation with, to the extent you have explained the concept of potential harm to your participants.
Right. Well, so the design of those abstracts, let me bring up one more of those abstracts, hold on. The design of those abstracts, we're trying to make sure that it's clear to people some sense of what the harm might be and what the benefits would be. So we have, at the bottom, we always have what happens if this study isn't run. So if the researchers are not allowed to collect this data, they can't measure how often users fall victims to attacks that target users' passwords. But we also tried to make sure that the potential harms are there. So, so we've got the researchers plan to deceive participants as to the purpose of this task they will be asked to complete. During this task, researchers will replicate the techniques that attackers use to trick users into typing their passwords. So we're trying to give people, we don't want to be biased and say, you might feel harmed because of AB. We don't want to prime them too much, but it's a very delicate balance of how do we get them where we want them. And again, we don't trust ourselves to do it, which is why we're actively soliciting other people to write abstracts for us as well. Yeah?
In your paper, had you provided this information, or was so the reviewer who was scandalized, were they aware of the harm as you represented it?
We didn't have this information when we got that. So we ran 200 more participants for a camera ready for a treatment that we really wanted to try. And when we did that, we asked about harm and got all of our harm data. So what we were able to tell them was, we were able to tell the program chair, listen, this was Microsoft spoofing Microsoft. So, this is information that they don't have. And so we don't, just make sure that, if you might, what the program chair does in that situation, knowing that it's trying to keep the fairness of anonymous review, but also trying to make sure that the reviewer is not going to rule out our paper based on an incorrect assumption about how the study was run and who the parties were involved and who was being spoofed. Fortunately, the reviewer who wrote that, it was a situation where there were rebuttals. And that reviewer did not seem to want to contribute to the rebuttal round at all. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming and sticking around.